Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 128th New Social Environment. I am Nick Bennett, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation between Catherine Opie and Lyle Rexer. We are also thrilled to have the poet Willie Perdomo here, who will read to close today's program. This week of the New Social Environment is supported by Dermot Company, and you can learn more about them and our 2016 curatorial project the Rail did with them through the link in the chat that will be posted in just a moment. The Brooklyn Rail acknowledges that we are on the unceded territory of the Lenni Lenape, Canarsie, Shinnecock, and Munsee peoples. We acknowledge that the many indigenous nations with ties to this land, and we recognize that the Lenape still call Mannahatta home. The Brooklyn Rail also stands in solidarity with the uprising unfolding across the country following the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Nina Pop, David McAtee, James Scurlock, Jamel Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, Rhea Milton, Dominique Remy Fells, Toyin Salau, and in response to generations of structural violence against Black communities. Black Lives Matter, and we will continue to support ongoing action in the struggle for racial justice. We also acknowledge today is 9/11 and that which happened 19 years ago today, and we dedicate this space to the victims and their families who we keep in our hearts dearly, and it also acknowledge the legacy of surveillance and increased militarized policing that continues to this day, both at home and abroad. Before I introduce our hosts for the day, please join us for a brief moment of silence. Thank you. Now to introduce our host. Lyle Rexer is an independent critic, curator, and writer. He's the author of numerous books, catalog essays, and articles on art, architecture, and photography. He contributes to many publications and writes a regular column for Photograph magazine. He lives in Brooklyn and teaches at the School of Visual Arts. I will keep it short and sweet. So with that, I pass the mic over to you, Lyle, and welcome both of you today.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks to the Rail. Thanks to Catherine for taking the time to do this interview. It's a real privilege for me, especially on this day where we have an enormous amount to consider and to think about. To be able to talk to somebody who I think is so important to our national consciousness. I wanted to say a couple of things in opening about Catherine. This is sort of basic stuff, and I think many of you may know this, but it's important to review it. She is a Guggenheim Fellow in 2019. That's one of her most recent accomplishments. She's a member of the National Academy of Arts and Letters. She has been on the board of LA MoCA, off and on. And I believe you are on the board currently, are you not? Yeah. Okay. She's one of the protesters who left, and now she's back, which I think is great. And she's also on the board of the Warhol Foundation, which is also tremendously important. And she is a professor at UCLA in photography. I think we can see from this profile. And could we put up the first picture, the first slide? This gives a little introduction to who she is. Let's see if Nick can put it up. Yeah, and there we go. One of the things I think there's a couple of things I want to say just in preamble before I start to ask Catherine some questions. She's enormously important from my perspective. As Nick said, I teach at the School of Visual Arts. First and foremost, because she's given permission to a lot of young people to make the kind of pictures that are meaningful to them. And that's been enormously important in my classes. I've seen that over and over again. It's no secret that young people, all of us were, and we all still are, looking for mentors and models, people who give us permission and people who tell us that it's okay to tell the stories that we want to tell. And in that sense, Catherine's been obviously a pioneer. She's been enormously important, and she continues to give permission and that's really important. The second thing is that I want to say is that having had a chance to review an enormous number of images from a really vast body of work, I wanted to offer the idea that there are any number of artists, photographers, writers who are often, the term Whitmanesque is often applied to them. Usually pretty loosely. It usually means you're undisciplined. But in Catherine's case, it seems to me that it absolutely implies, if it's absolutely appropriate. And if there is a single photographer today who deserves that epithet, it seems to me it's her. And it has to do with the notion of an embrace or a sense of community that she's investigated, she's committed herself to, and she's really fought for. And I find that kind of openness to experience, that willingness to embrace kind of whatever reality is out there, has been inspirational to me just in the last, even in the last 24 hours where I've had a chance to review it. And I would have us think about her and think about her work in those really expansive terms. And so without further ado, we have this picture of her when she was very young, and she's making mussels. And I want to go through, if we could go through just a few of the first 5 images. We can scroll through those. This is a kind of resume of, you might say, the physical presence and the photographic presence of Catherine Opie. Many of these are iconic pictures. But the other thing about them, even though they are iconic, they've been enshrined in our, you might say, our vocabulary politically, photographically, aesthetically. They're also super personal, even though they've become these icons, you might say. And I was just going to ask you, as we scroll through these first 5, and they're really quite different, they come from different periods, does it give you strange feelings to look at these pictures as a group and to kind of walk through, you know, what most people see, again, is kind of iconic pictures, but for you, it's much more personal?
Yeah, I don't know if it's a strange feeling if I would describe it as that. It's just history for me. I mean, it's, you know, given the different moments of time that you're with your work and you make your work, and you never really expect when you're making your work that it becomes iconic or actually part of art history to a certain extent. And, you know, it's just like getting various tattoos on your body. It's just a marker of time. And so I really look at photography as something that embraces not only what I think about in terms of my own sensibility and creating representations, but it's also going back and looking at it is just yet another marker of my time. I mean, self-portrait nursing, I was pregnant with Oliver when 9/11 happened in New York.
Exactly.
And now I dropped him off at college. And so photography, I think, in all of our lives and how we grow up with photography, if our parents took images of us, we were surrounded by that sensibility as creating our memories. And I still approach thinking about photography in that way, I think.
What's funny thing, it reminds me of something Stephen Shore once said in an interview that I read with him. And he said, you know, the thing you should always remember about taking a photograph is put a car in it. So you know what the time period is. And in your case, it's more like, I'll put myself in it. That's the way I'm going to recognize exactly where I am. But we can see that I want to come back to these, but I think it's important, given our political moment, given our kind of historical situation, if we can go to the swamp pictures, okay? That's number 6, that's our slide, but yeah, perfect. I wonder, I was very concerned when we talked the other day, I want to focus as much as we can on your current work. We'll go back to the portraits because those are enormously important, but your current work, you're on the road, and you've been on the road for, well, certainly since 1990, or since, you know, over the last couple of years, I think, the last year and a half. Can you tell us about what you're doing, and particularly these pictures, which are taken in the swamps of northern Florida and southern Georgia? Tell us where you are on the road these days. What is this project about?
Well, this was particularly made, the swamps were made in relationship to the idea of what's happening in this country in relationship to rhetoric. So the exhibition and the body of work that goes with it is titled Rhetorical Landscapes. And the swamp to me has been such a interesting place. My wife is from Louisiana. I've spent every Christmas in Louisiana. The South isn't a place that I grew up in, but it's a place that represents so much of the psyche of our country in various ways. So we're right in the middle of an enormous amount of fighting again in terms of racial injustice. And the swamp and what that means for the South and the passing through of Black bodies in relationship to it as a landscape and trying to get to freedom. And just the way that the language has surrounded it under the Trump administration made me want to go and take very kind of pristine, and I've called it this, Lyle, a number of interviews, and you'll laugh at this, but I think of them as amateur National Geographic photographs.
Yeah, Nick, can we go forward and take a look at a few more, especially with the alligator, right? No.
Yeah, there's an alligator, there's an owl, but it is about this kind of pristine beauty. And the relationship of it to also global warming is utterly important as well. So it's like, how do we look at landscape at this point in time? What does a landscape photograph do? It's like, if we think about, kind of Carlton Watkins or Adams or certain kind of preservation through making images, I'm not completely interested in necessarily having these be about preservation, but more about the language of how we occupy the politics that we're in, and that a landscape can begin to be a site of those kinds of political awareness, so to speak, but also wrapped up in global warming and other things.
Right, but what struck me about this again is, do you have other, you talk about Watkins, were there other photographers in your head as you were shooting these pictures? Because they're, you call them National Geo. Are you deliberately attempting to kind of downplay your own role in this? Are you thinking about other American photographers? I mean, they're kind of wonderful pictures. I think you don't do them justice. Okay.
No, what I mean by amateur National Geographic is that I'm no longer shooting with a large format. Right. For somebody who's shot with a large format for so many years, and even when you look at high school football as a landscape, because that's I was using a digital Hasselblad at that point, and it was a 50 megapixel. So these are back to 35 millimeter. I mean, this is a Canon, doing 35 millimeter landscapes. And I use depth of field in a very specific way within landscape in this work that takes it away from that kind of idea of what large format photography does in terms of representing ideas of American West and landscape photography specifically.
And I don't want to kind of spend too much time, but there's the landscape is crucial, it seems to me, is why I was happy to start here. It's so important to so much of what comes later and what came earlier. In these pictures particularly, are you trying to kind of push us into the picture without giving us that kind of expansiveness? I just want to get a sense of where we stand in relation to this.
Yeah, I find swamps expansive and claustrophobic at the same time. So the reflection becomes the expanse. The interesting thing about this image is if you stand in front of it, in front of the gallery, which is really different, obviously, than when you stand before work. It's always a different experience, especially because an artist decides what scale it should be at, all of that. But the reflection is sharper than the actual upper part of the photograph in this, because of the way that I'm using depth of field from the boat. But then also there's slightly moments within that reflection that looks like a digital alteration because the water's moving slightly. So there's also this kind of interesting, weird conversation in it around what pixels do, but really, like the idea, can being reflective at this moment metaphorically, like actually being reflective, does that come across in a certain way, of how these images get metaphorically loaded as well?
Yeah, you made reference. If we could go to image 72, okay, as long as we're going to do this, let's go to 72. You made that reference to those wonderful pictures of the high school football players, which you were doing in 2000, I think in 2009, somewhere around there.
Yeah,
You're doing
yeah.
those wonderful portraits. And what I loved about these pictures, quite apart from the fact that, these might be your Sports Illustrated pictures. Okay, you did your National
my
Geographic.
bad Sports
Your
Illustrated.
bad Sports Illustrated pictures. But it was very clear what the intentions were of these, and I thought they were quite wonderful to set these young men always in a landscape,
Yeah.
and then to show the who they are in terms of not only their youth and their ambitions, whatever they are, their uncertainties, their developments, and again, as you make very clear, their identities, their whatever sense of masculinity that they are portraying, to put those in a kind of wider natural setting. I found that tremendously important as a way of thinking about these young men. And I
Oh,
wondered if
thank
you
you.
maybe talk about that a little bit more, about that
Yeah, I mean,
relationship.
I was thinking about the idea of American landscape, right? What do we do with it? And when we think about even the history of it in terms of like kind of grandiose painting of the American West or Bierstadt, or ideas around how landscape has been represented, we now know sports primarily through a zoom lens, through an action. And even when we're watching it on TV, we know it as a camera kind of zooming down in, like it's almost like drone. It's like how much drone footage in every single thing that we watch at this point. And what I find so interesting is that that the high school football field is the utter American landscape when you think about it, kind of ideologically, and what it builds in this idea of American landscape. So that's why I went from Hawaii to Alaska to the east to Texas, because what is it to image American landscape now in a certain way? So high school football was an ability to talk about it at a time it also in increased vulnerability for these young men who are going off to be soldiers. So what is it to look at this youth at this moment in time and to bear witness on something that hadn't been photographed beyond the objectification of the sport, but realizing that exists within a landscape, a community, and what
Yeah,
it
and
means for
absolutely, and a kind of set of
community.
symbols and all that. You use the term, you just use the term bearing witness. I wonder if we can go back to the series that you've been doing most recently, and if we can go back to sort of slide 13. You've been on the road again.
Yeah, I
Um,
just got back. And
and
these are the first images anybody's seeing of these,
yeah,
because
and
you found out that I was on the road.
and so, it's funny because I never thought of you as a road photographer, but like a whole bunch of images that I pulled last night and today are all road pictures, and they're really quite amazing and important, I think. But this series in particular, obviously, you're on a mission. And could you talk a little bit about sort of where you're headed and what you're attempting to do in these pictures?
Well,
And
I
we can
think
just
that,
scroll through these as
yeah,
well.
I think being a photographer, it's very confusing times sometimes to be a photographer. Like, what does it mean to kind of do studio work? What does it mean to, kind of make a career out of very formal portraits, but also wanting to always go out and look at the landscape? What is the language these days? And I remember in March when COVID started, and I was like, wow, my studio shut down. I'm not going to be making any portraits. I'm not going to be doing anything. I started doing the Black Lives Matters protests in Los Angeles, and was really affected by what was happening in this country and the continuing rhetoric of our, of the president. And I was just thinking about, the notion of systemic racism in this country, especially in relationship to Confederate monuments and why they were built and where they were built and how they, the space around them has as much specificity as the monument in itself. Like, where does this reside? How does it sit? And so I became completely obsessed with most people who are following what's going on right now with just kind of too much news, right? And I was really grateful for photojournalists. But within photojournalism, there's never really that moment of the pause, right? And I talk about the pause a lot in photography, and where an empty space or juxtaposition of an image allows you to think a little bit possibly deeper in relationship to what it is you're looking at. So we knew that we had to take our son to college and that he was going to start in person at Tulane University.
The heart of
And
the South. That's
exactly. And my wife is from Louisiana, and we have lots of conversations about Louisiana specifically. This one was shrouded. It wasn't even removed, it was shrouded. And so there's an amazing map from the Southern Poverty Law that shows that is a live map that you can do in Google to go to monuments. And I mapped out this trip based on that, but also going to the Peace and Justice Memorial in Montgomery, Alabama, photographing monuments that still exist, monuments that I had to find that were removed. North Carolina did it the most inconspicuous way, where it was completely removed. It wasn't shrouded, it wasn't covered up, but it was just like, even it was hard to find it. You had to look for where the grass was replaced. And this is happening really, really quickly. This was the kind of one that in the media just blew me away of looking at photojournalism. And this is in Richmond, Virginia, and it's the Robert E. Lee that has now become the utter site of activism. So the other thing is, does this monument come down now because we need it to be a monument, or is it a monument of this time? So how do we think about that as language within in the landscape as well? And so I spent 3.5 weeks, drove 7,000 miles, and made hundreds of images that you're seeing the very first of that I haven't even edited. Yeah. Now, this is really interesting because this is in Kentucky, right across the street from the Breonna Taylor Memorial. And often you don't see what's around it, right? That's the other thing about this notion of placement, because I never realized that Kehinde Wiley's monument is charging into the Daughters of the Confederacy, who put up all these monuments. I didn't know that that was the juxtaposition of Kehinde's monument. Yeah. So you see the Hall of Justice boarded up, and then you have this on a rainy day where they've tarped like the objects brought to her memorial site. And, I'm calling this body of work at this moment in time 2020. It reminds me of the road trip that I did in 1999, but it has more specificity to it. And I'll continue to photograph. I'll leave in October and go up to Oregon to photograph Portland, and go up to Seattle and kind of do a little bit of West Coast, also the fires, the devastation of the fires here. So I wanted to just kind of hold. Now, this is an interesting image that is from Lincoln's there at Lincoln's, like, basically childhood home. A museum was built. And so all of these, like, various things that you find within the landscape and how you begin to form it as a body of work is what I'm trying to achieve right now.
Again, you use that expression about, and it's one that documentarians or photojournalists use all the time, but I really want to explore it a little more, and that is this idea of bearing witness, being a witness. This is a very specific kind of witnessing you're doing. I wonder if you talk a little bit more about how that theme or idea, has that been something that's run through your work always? Have you always thought of yourself as sort of needing to be a witness? Or is it very specific to this project that you're working on now?
I think that the first time that I used bearing witness was actually with the high school football players. I think that even when I did 1999 or other bodies of work, or even driving in an RV to do domestic, lesbian domestic, where I spent 3.5
Right.
months driving around the country, I don't think that I ever used bearing witness to that. But there was a moment with high school football within the vulnerability of these young men, and especially there was 2 times that I got letters back from parents telling me how important their photograph of their son that I made was, because everybody got a image. So everybody in the body of work, whether it ended up in the body of work or not, images were sent back to the team to have. And 2 parents wrote me and said how important that image was because their son died in Afghanistan. And all of a sudden it made me realize that I was doing something different, that I was bearing witness, that there was history that was happening that I didn't really anticipate. I was just looking at actually the football series started in Louisiana. This was taken in Church Point, Louisiana, where my wife is from.
Mm-hmm.
And I was going to be there for 3 weeks visiting her family. And I was like, what am I going to do for 3 weeks? And I have 25 nieces and nephews on that side of the family. And so I called my nephews and asked if I could start photographing their football practices. And then it turned into this whole thing. So that kind of idea also of exploration always within the bodies of work is really important and interesting to me. But before I was a street photographer, Lyle, I came out of SFAI. I came out of
I
Burkle
know.
Jones and Hank Wessel and Larry Salton. And in the 80s, that was where I was trained. And then from that, I went to Cal Arts and was trained through Alan Sekula and Catherine Lord and Judy Fiskin and that group of photographers. So you didn't really use the word bearing witness in relationship to that period of photography, especially with a kind of conceptualization of documentary, right? All of a sudden, documentary photography began to have a different language attached to it
Absolutely.
and especially because of the picture generation as well.
Right.
And so I kind of adopted this relationship to bearing witness, I would say, in the mid 2000s, realizing that I was one of those photographers that was holding a camera in my hand still and wanting to go out and make images in the world when everybody was becoming more insular. More work, as you've done with your book on abstraction, became kind of the thing within photography.
Right.
And I still wanted to place the notion of documentary being very important within my practice.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love, I don't want to do this now, but maybe if we have a little bit more time, we'll go back to those 1999 road trip pictures if we have a chance. I don't want to get hung up there, but the 99 pictures, it's like you're channeling, or it's like you're speaking in tongues. It's like all these. You know what? Let's do it. Let's go to. I want to look at one in particular.
It's like the back of a billboard, nod to Lang's front of a billboard. Okay, yeah, go to the back of the billboard. You have it in there.
Yeah, which one's that? It's right.
Let's scroll down. I mean, the first one, it starts out with this pier, but here we go, 26. Go to 26.
Right. Yeah, that's a good one.
So again, it's like the language of photography. In 99,
right.
You have the telephone pole that makes the cross, right?
Yes, absolutely.
In terms of the continuing Christian fundamentalism that was happening within this country, Tea Party, a lot of stuff was going on. And then we were afraid that we were going to lose our information because of Y2K. So you have the disinformation of the back of the billboard instead of what you would have had during kind of Walker Evans, Dorothea Lange time, which would be the front of the billboard. So there's a lot of kind of nuance and language within ideas around the history of photography that gets implanted within this body of work.
Absolutely. And one of the things that, I love the stuff as somebody who's a kind of an amateur art historian. I love to see you just doing all this referencing. My favorite of the group is the cloud that looks like a flying saucer.
Oh, it looks like a UFO. 32. Yeah, exactly. The UFO cloud. Yeah, and then the hand painted signs, and there's one of the first swamps actually. So
yeah, but there is one in this group that I think that I want to go back to, and that's number 28. I mean, I love all these. Okay, we could have put 3 times as many in because it's a great series, but this one in particular, and I'm interested in the fact that among the other things that you're looking at, and of course that I don't think American photographers, certainly in the 70s and 80s, which is kind of when this language began to be developed, are thinking about so much, is you're thinking about the kinds of gender relationships and the kinds of things that are being promoted vis-a-vis identity. And it comes up in pictures like this, which I think is really, looks like one of those conventional pictures of like, oh yeah, it's great, it's American signage, but it's clearly, it's a little lesson about how people are supposed to live their lives.
Well, it's, I think nostalgia, and we were talking about this a little bit, is really, it is so heavily laden in photography. And so the idea of this hand painting sign goes back, and even the woman and the man goes back to a 50s kind of idea, right? And so here we are in 1999, right before 2000,
Right before 2000.
and this still exists of the candy canes and everything that is there. It's still written, the nostalgia is still written within the American landscape. And I think that if you think about me thinking about this in 1999 and then how it's ramped up under the Trump administration, it's really fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of pictures that feel like the end of something and the beginning of something else. Is one of the reasons why it seems so, it's like right before the millennium. It's kind of like you taking stock of what you've seen or what you're seeing out there. Just as we have some sense, we had no idea about what was about to happen, but things were definitely about to shift forever. And I find these pictures in that sense really evocative, just loaded with that kind of, maybe foreboding is the right word. It's obviously retrospective, but
Yeah.
you mentioned the Cal Arts thing, and I want to go to slide 44, 45, and 46. Okay.
Oh yeah, here we go.
This is your
Yeah.
project. This is your master's
My
thesis project.
yeah, my thesis.
And there's a couple of things that struck me, and I want you to talk about this. But the thing that seemed most important to me was in this project, out of it, which seemed to have all these different parts, it's almost like a blueprint for all the things you were going to do. The portraits, this connection between landscape and people, changing the frame. I mean, it's remarkable as a kind of, you might say, as a herald of things to come. So I wonder if you'd talk about your ideas that were behind this, how portraits and landscape fit together, all that stuff that was going on in your head when you were doing this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the huge influences, obviously, within this body of work is new topographics as well.
Right.
But new topographics had its like specificity that was, when you think about Louis Baltz's kind of industrial park images, even the fact that he had the coordinates of where he took the photographs. Like one of the things that I wanted to kind of do is break up the way that we look at things in through both portraiture, landscape, interior, exterior. And then especially how a community is sold. So this is all about white flight from the urban area,
Absolutely.
It is like the pink shirt wearing girl with I Come Home to Valencia and the baseball playing boy. Even the model homes were set up with the girls' room as cheerleaders and the boys' rooms as baseball players. So I wanted to actually pick apart the structure of ideas of what a master plan was. And a master plan, even in its language, is really echoing master race to a certain extent. Like you can't deny that as existing within it. And then what does it mean for me to be like this leather dyke, who came out of San Francisco, at the time of the beginning of the AIDS crisis, to end up at Cal Arts working with the faculty that I was working with. I didn't have a car. And so I just started wandering the neighborhoods and photographing it, and realized that this, and it was so funny because Catherine and different professors would say, but I don't understand, why aren't you making queer work? Like you're like, I don't get it. Like, why aren't you making queer work? And Doug Ishar was in school with me, and he was doing an amazing project on the eagle in San Francisco. That is to this day some of the best, interesting images around it. And I just said, but I think that this is queer because it's the examination of the idea of what people think is normal within society. And so you have these family photographs, and I interviewed them. So I literally spent 2 years only working on this, and the image, it ended up being a 200 image body of work. And so 2 exhibitions of it. And then I switched up to being and having, right after I graduated.
Yeah, it's a really, I mean, that's a heavy duty shift. Do you want to talk about that shift? I mean,
well, yeah, you have a quote up here. That's good. Let me read this.
yeah. I know that you've referenced Lacan and the kinds of discussions you were having in your community, but one that was really on my mind was Gabriel Marcel, from his book, which he wrote in the 40s, called Being and Having. It was his kind of his journals in a way. He said, being and having in our society teaches us how to take possession of things. It should rather initiate us in the art of letting go, where there is neither freedom nor real life without an apprenticeship in letting go. And I think that for me, that was a resonant quote, because when you did Being and Having, you did that series, you let go. I mean, you put yourself out there in ways that were really, really quite remarkable. And I wonder if you talk about, was there fear behind that? Was there anxiety? Or were you at that point, because you had all these professors saying, why don't you do queer work? It's like, why don't you get with it, Catherine, and get busy? I mean, how did you feel about how these pictures would be, people would deal with them? What do you think would happen?
It started out with just like really playing with my friends again. It's just like I had this amazing community in LA that I had finally found after leaving my San Francisco community that was so important to me. I finally had like a place to feel that I was with people. And we would wear fake mustaches and go to the one only 7-day-a-week lesbian bar in LA on our motorcycles. And we would try to pick up girls. And then I just thought, like, I want to do portraits of these. And I don't even remember literally how I came up conceptually, but obviously I did it, very, very specific, keeping the same yellow background. I shot them in my living room in Silver Lake. Everybody brought their mustaches over. We kind of had fun with it. But it was so much tied into always being called sir. Like my whole life just being called sir. And I've always been proud of my little mustache that I have. I don't really try to wax it or remove it. It's just like it's part of me. And just wanting to stare back. And I was thinking a lot about how women were represented within photography.
Absolutely.
And what did it mean for women to be wearing facial hair and giving that direct gaze back? And then it just turned on into making more portraits, studio portraits. And so everybody has their nickname that they chose. So this is Papa Bear. I'm Bo. And there's even a nickname, Oh So Bad. So it was really tongue in cheek and trying to have fun with drag and have it be performative, but also an awkward portrait. And then I went into making much more formal portraits.
Right. And that choice to become more formal, there's actually 3 bodies of work that I'd love to look at, and I think we have time to do them, not in the proper depth, but you start out, things become more formal. They're still fairly straightforward. You're changing cameras. Are you becoming more sort of studio conscious? What's going on for you as you begin to do these?
Both 4x5 cameras. So shooting large format, even with Being and Having, that was the funny thing, is you could see the webbing and you could see the fakeness. People still assume, just like they assume I'm a guy every day and call me sir, people still assumed in looking at those photographs that they were looking at men. I mean, there was a woman who I had a show in Santa Barbara of the images who came up to me and had been a docent at the museum, who said, I think I know some of these guys. And I said, they're all lesbians with fake mustaches and beards, you know?
That's great.
It's like, you don't
So
actually know
fantastic.
these guys, you know?
Yeah.
But the formality was a way to bring in the idea. I think that one of the things is Mapplethorpe did this so beautifully is like, how do you bring the kind of aesthetics and formal aspect of portraiture? And I wanted it to be about the body and my community. And if I had photographed them in black and white in their homes, it would have maintained a kind of certain documentary position within photography that I was trying to interrupt and have more of a conversation with painting, actually. So
Yeah, it's super interesting you say that, because I had this conversation with Dawood Bey for the Rail a few weeks ago, and he said exactly the same thing about his movement away from black and white into a more formal kind of portrait setting. He wanted to change the relationship of the viewer to the subject, and he also wanted to get into dialogue with painting about the painted subject. And I find it striking that that's so important to, to your way of thinking about the portrait.
well, I think when you think about Dawood and I too, it's just like how we shifted. And I mean, he's a few years older than I am, but we grew up in a period of time of, literally going from both of us being street photographers. We wandered with the camera and we made black and white images out in the world. My street photography is not really well known because that was all undergraduate work for the most part.
Right.
I would say that the street photography comes back in when I'm doing these protest photographs or other aspects of where I've moved it to at this point.
Mm-hmm.
But it was like, what do we do with the picture generation? What do we do with color, especially with color photography really being accepted in a different way at this point in time? Because these were started in 1990 and I continued them till about 95. And so one of the ways to get people to look is to use that kind of formal aspect of the language of painting, which people were familiar with, but you were able to honor kind of the royal family, in my mind, honor the subject in a different way that didn't objectify them in the way that necessarily they were being objectified by mainstream culture.
Right, and clearly you have a relationship with the people you're shooting in these pictures. I mean, you are in dialogue with them, and that, to my mind, comes through very strongly. They have their own space, they have their own authority, and so do you. And that kind of relationship or that dynamic to me is really fascinating in these. I wanted to jump forward to pictures that I didn't know well at all, that have really made an impression on me. And I wonder if you talk about these a little bit. If we go to, let's see, hold on. If we go to 59 and following.
Oh, Ron Athey, the Polaroids, the mega Polaroid camera in New York.
Yes, absolutely.
These were taken. They showed in completion at Thread Waxing Gallery.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting because in New York with Thread Waxing Gallery, doing this exhibition, it was the same time that Giuliani was trying to shut down
Sensation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
And Brooklyn Museum and going after Chris Ophelia and stuff.
Yep.
So I was like, oh my God, am I going to be censored? I mean, I have all these super big giant Polaroids of Ron Athey. Like, how is that going to come across under Giuliani's administration in New York and his kind of attack against art and freedom of speech in that way? But it didn't, and it was a 2-day period of time of making these Polaroids, and I made them specifically for Ron's work to be funded. So all the work was sold through the AIDS Project. All the money went to Ron, and then a few have shown. I mean, the other largest next selection would have been in the Guggenheim Museum.
Right.
But this is Lee Bowery's Cape, and so this is a pause in the body of work.
Yep.
Because the images really ramp up. They're all based on Ron Athey's performances.
Yes.
And some are based, like the last one that was shown was more based on something that Ron does in his performance, but there's a complete nod to Mapplethorpe's self-portrait with a whip.
Yeah, of course.
So there's often like a conversation that I'm bringing up with kind of the history of photography.
You know, if we can go to the one where Ron is doing the tattooing or the
The
scarification.
scarification on
Yeah,
Daryl's back. Yeah.
yeah, these are astonishing pictures. I mean, and obviously they reference Mapplethorpe, but the game is really changing from your perspective. You're trying to do something really quite different. And I wonder if you talk a little bit about that in relation to Ron and in relation to just the whole idea of the culture and the community out of which you have come and you identified with. Can you talk about why these are important, or are they important? They strike me as a
Yeah, no,
remarkable picture.
I mean, I think they're really important for not only me to work with that camera on a technical level and what it was like to actually achieve these images, was because this isn't a lens that can be focused.
No,
This
absolutely.
is moving a body in and out. The lens is mounted to a drywall, when you don't even have modeling lights on the strobes. And in order, if anybody has worked with large format, Polaroids, you need a lot of light to get it to work. And so the challenge of it, both technically, but also to then follow my own aesthetic in representing Ron's work, was
Right.
just a really amazing experience. So this is truly a collaboration, because I am using what Ron does on stage to, kind of create a body of work that is as theatrical as what Ron is doing. And I think it was just a really interesting moment for me, in which it wasn't purely my authorship, even though it's my aesthetics,
Right.
but to work with him on this.
Yeah, and there's something about the fact that it's a Polaroid, supposedly an instant picture, right? But it's
Yeah,
gigantic.
really big Polaroid.
A really big
Yeah,
Polaroid.
the Moby. It was called the Moby. It was brought over to New York, and actually, I think the last work that was done on this camera before there was not any more film on this day we can talk about this, was they opened up the studio to the photographer who did amazing portraits of first responders to 9/11 with this
Hmm.
camera.
Right.
And I'm sorry I can't name the
I'm blanking as well, but I know
I
exactly what you mean.
apologize. But they're so different from these, obviously, in terms of subject, but also what that camera did, and the depth of field and everything was just really amazing experience.
Well, in relationship to that kind of evolution of the portrait for you, or let's say your relationship of you to painting and art history, I want to kind of move toward maybe a final discussion, and it has to do with kind of some of the portraits that have come more subsequently, where you've mixed portraiture and landscape together
Yeah.
in exhibitions. And if we can go, I think you start with um, let's say
Yeah, and I
63.
didn't fall in love with black until I did this Polaroid. So that's the
Well,
other
that's
thing
the
that's so
yes,
interesting to think about, is like, what does a photographer see within one body of work that they can't get out of their mind, that they have to then repeat again? And I think that this Polaroid work, in a certain way, with using the black background, allowed me to think about that space that was very different than the color, as an actual space that is a psychological
right. Let's
space.
go to 70, for example. Right now we're doing the kind of an abstract landscape, but let's go to 70.
My
For example,
niece.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and here, you kind of working out your, how should we say, your Caravaggio Jones, or your,
Yeah. I
uh,
know.
and it runs through a lot of these pictures, that kind of darkness that you want to embrace. And it's not that threatening darkness of, I don't know, some sort of existential crisis, but maybe something much more beautiful,
I think
or
about it
more
as the
comforting.
subconscious. Our subconscious, what emerges from the darkness, the idea of darkness as being some maybe place of vulnerability, but that there's an emergence from it with the way that you light the body and how you can kind of create a portrait. And this is of my niece, and she's pregnant with her second child here. And, you know, it was just one of those, I said, hey, let me do pregnancy pictures of you for you. And, you know, she came over to the studio, and then Owen just looked up at the light that way on her lap. And I said, listen, this is more than a pregnancy photo now. Can I use it for exhibition? And she had to.
And, and
Yeah.
when you came to exhibit these, you can go back to 68, image 68, if we can do that. You were also showing them in the context of that, and that's a wonderful one of the
Jonathan Franzen reading War and
Jonathan
Peace.
Franzen reading, yes.
Yeah.
You're showing them in the context of these landscape photographs, which are, you know, as you say, quite blurry, kind of indistinct. Could you talk to me about the relationship between that the specificity of the portrait and these kind of vague? And you put them right across the you know, the wall from each
Oh
other.
yeah, they're in there together. They're meant to be together. And I was really thinking about our cognitive relationship to imagery. What is our relationship to photography at this time period? I was thinking a lot about how people get out at a national park, a very well-known thing. They get out of their car, they take out their phone, they take a picture of it, and they get back in their car and they drive off. And also, do nature photographs even hold us anymore? Like, what is our relationship to it, you know? And with portraiture in these abstract landscapes from very iconic known places, do we spend more time? Have I slowed you down on a cognitive level to be actually held by an image? What does it mean for an image to hold you? And your brain has to work out figuring out what you're looking at. You think you know what you're looking at, and you're looking at a lot of color and a lot of things, but it is a real sight, and I'm just racking the focus and have the aperture all the way open in the camera. Um, and it was a way for me to be able to talk about longing, and the notion of longing and aging, and what it is to really be held and pause and not be flicking through our Instagram, consuming hundreds of images in a, you know, in moments, but what it is to just slow everything down. So it was also in response to just what I feel has, you know, made us not really spend time with photographs in the way that I wish that people would spend time with them, that they're much more loaded with meaning than just a simple flick of the finger and going on to the next image.
And I think you're right in the sense that, you know, I've seen students, I've seen dealers, I've seen all the people in the photo world, and I've done it myself, go through images, you know, in rapid succession, as if they had no, almost as if they had no content. And it's always good. You're reminding me what Bill Brandt once said, which is, you know, what we're after is something that's not in a hurry. And we're in such a hurry that, you know, that's why I loved so many of these pictures, because there are pauses, there are things that are very calm, there are things that make us slow down, like this one.
Yeah, and they're allegorical too. And I'm not somebody who plays with allegory a whole lot. I mean, I would say that this carries over from thinking about Ron Athey. But at
Yes.
the time of beginning this body of work, I was also going through menopause. And menopause isn't really talked about among women that much, you know? It's like you talk about other things, but you don't talk about like how much menopause it really changes your body. So the idea of menopause and pause, like again, like I pile language on top of language. So having like Kate and Laura of Rodarte embroider a blood drip. There's also in the first body of work in the first year, there's an enormous amount of reference to blood.
Right.
As I continued with the body of work, it changed. But it was the first exhibition at Regan Projects was there was a lot of blood in it,
Yes.
or reference to blood in the body.
Yeah.
and I think that, you know, that was a nod to me thinking about, oh, I don't bleed anymore. What does that mean? You know?
Right.
So,
Right. No,
done with
obviously
that.
that's, yeah, what's going on. I mean, no. And these are, I mean, these are super, I think super compelling themes. And as you say, you have been that person who has been willing to make the images that in many cases, either people wanted to make but didn't, or were afraid to make, or simply there was a need, there was an empty space, and that space needed to be it needed its images. And I wanted to ask you, as someone who was obviously associated with an S&M community, and obviously with a lesbian community, did you face during the 60s, and maybe this seems, or I mean during the 80s, a kind of backlash against the work you were doing ever? I mean,
You know,
there were lots of
that
splits in
was
that community.
a shocking thing for me. I think that people were surprised when they would interview me after seeing my work up. They were surprised that I was like, you know, kind of a humble, kind person. They imagined they had these own ideas that were probably laden with what they think about the SM community, you know?
Right.
And, but I have always been surprised. I was always kind of surprised how little censorship that I faced within my lifetime, especially watching Jesse Helms and, you know, what was going down in terms of the culture wars, and being you know, adult at that moment of time making work. And I also thought when I made the early work, well, I'm screwed. I'm never going to get a teaching job.
Right.
And I
Right.
thought, like, well, I have to make this work because this is what I want to make. And it's so important to make the work that you want to make. But I also thought it was going to shut down my life in a lot of different ways. And then when that didn't happen, when the art world embraced me in such a major way, you have to think of the first time that pervert ever showed. And
Yes.
I'm making work within my community, but the first time it ever shows is the 95 Whitney biennial. And so it had never been publicly exhibited at that point. And
Number
so,
3. Yeah. Slide 3.
yeah, for that to happen and then be part of this discourse and relationship to AIDS and queerness and the devastation of my community, you know, during that epidemic, that ongoing epidemic that still does not have a cure for AIDS. It was so important for me to make work that was poking back at the rigidness of and homophobia within our society. And I think that I'm still trying to poke back in different ways, but maybe not poke myself.
Well, you know,
Oh,
and
I
I
have
guess
to say that. I mean, I'm sitting here looking at it.
that's right. You know, but it does prompt a final question that I've been wanting to ask you since I first started looking at your work for this presentation, and that is, you know, you've been on the road, you've seen, you know, kind of where the tensions are, and you're
Mhm.
continuing to go out there. How are you feeling just sort of about where we are? What do you think about the country after all?
I'm optimistic and horrified at the same time within my optimism. No, I actually, you know, I grew up really thinking a lot about the history of American politics. Own largest political campaign collection that's all in the Smithsonian. So I grew up with the Lincoln stereotypes in my home.
Wow.
I
Yeah.
grew up around this kind of amazing American history. My family is, you know, we've been here for a long time. Like I could join the Daughters of American Revolution kind of thing. My grandmother was very proud of being part of DAR. And it's not something, I'm not that kind of American. I try to poke holes in things a little bit around that kind of nationalistic identity. But I would have to say that, you know, when you look at the history of presidencies and the bad presidents that we've had in this country, that every single one of them had 40% of the population still behind them, and none of them won re-election. So I want to take that note in stride in terms of American history, and just really hope that this one isn't completely stolen. And we have to get rid of the Electoral College at this point. It had, between this happening under Gore and then again with Clinton, I mean, we have to change things.
Well, Catherine, I really
And
appreciate
we
you
have
taking.
to vote.
Yeah, we have to vote. Absolutely.
We
Even if
have
we're,
to vote.
right,
Even if you
we're
don't
from blue
love
states,
them, you have to vote.
gotta
Yeah,
vote.
gotta
Absolutely.
vote.
I really appreciate you taking the time to talk
Thank
to
you.
me, and it's been a pleasure. Nick, I know there may be questions that we've had people kind of sending in.
Yes. Well, I mean, firstly, I want to thank you both, Kathy and Lyle, for a really, really wonderful conversation.
Oh, thanks, Nick.
This feels like almost like a crash course in a masterclass of radical photography. So we've gotten quite a few questions. I hope we can get to most of them.
Okay.
But I would first like to pass the mic over to actually my own colleague, Malvika. Malvika, I think you can activate your mic now.
Hi. I just wanted to thank you both for this talk. It's been incredible. I guess my question, I'm still working on it, but I was really taken with what you said at the very beginning, that this idea of master plan has embedded within it master race. And I guess with regard to self-portrait cutting and then self-portrait pervert, I see these as like two sides of the same predicament, as kind of like queer communities chasing respectability on sort of mainstream or heteronormative terms, and how I guess that's very frustrating because the master plan to me is quite niche. And I guess my question is, like, given the last 20, last 30 years, have we, in sort of the way that when queer communities have been or are beginning to be folded into a kind of master plan of heteronormative American life, or like the fiction of heteronormative American mainstream life, how do you land, right, in this question of like,
I think that's such an important question, and it's such a conflicting question, because in terms of radical views or politics, there are so many different nuances within that. One of the biggest arguments within my community through trying to get the right to marry was like, no, we don't want to kind of model heteronormative society. But my argument in the right to get married was the right in relationship of the federal government acknowledging it, as well as the rights of seeing so many of my friends and their families come in, and after they die of AIDS, take everything away from the partner because the partner had no right to that.
Yep.
And so my idea of it was never in relationship to modeling the nuclear family or the American dream, even though I might have carved that on my back. It's satirical as well, that cutting on my back. It's not just about longing, but it's also satire, is that it's about the idea of how this country is formed in the notion of freedom of all people, and yet that the dialogue around that, as well as the laws around that, do not allow for that. So I really look at it as a really positive thing that I was able to legally marry my partner, and we did. And I only did it when it was handed down from the Supreme Court. I did not get married in California. I remained domestic partner because I believe that then it gave me the same kind of equal rights. Why should I pay for an attorney thousands and thousands of dollars for my estate plan when all I needed was a marriage certificate for things to be transferred? So those were the things that were really bothering me. And I looked at it very differently than trying to model a heteronormative way of living. And that's kind of how I think a little bit about the fight for of right of same-sex marriage. But then there's just a whole huge host of other issues that we're still obviously fighting for. I mean, trans lives right now is really heartbreaking. And homophobia is heartbreaking. I've had to deal with it my whole entire life, and it's only been ramped up under this administration. And what do we do with that? We continue to take to the streets. We continue to articulate it. Artists need to make work if that's where their ideas lie within making work. And we still have to give voice. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you.
I think it does very, very beautifully. Thank you, Malvika, and thank you, Kathy. I am next going to turn the mic over to Jamie. I think this is kind of a good segue into sort of what you're talking about, Kathy, in terms of how the personal comes out in your work. Jamie, I am going to pass the mic over to you. You should be able to.
There, I think it worked.
There you are, yeah.
Well, I have only recently changed mediums. I've always been a sculptor and worked a lot with feminine form and nature and organic materials and that sort of thing. And recently I switched to photography. And I did this very powerful body of work that was really lovely about psychological manipulation and abuse and what that looks like. And so now I'm moving into this next wave, and it's all about intimacy. And I'm not having a conversation with just the intimacy between a couple, but the intimacy between the universe, nature, all sorts of things. But my question is, I guess, because I'm moving into this newer space, and there's a lot of there is a lot of physical exploration, and I do a lot of photography similar to using myself as part of the medium, not necessarily as the subject, but as the medium. In your opinion, can you just kind of talk about where that line is drawn between what we socially see as pornography or overt eroticism, or how do you is there a definitive line? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense, Jamie. And it's such a complicated thing. And it's something that I always thought about in relationship to Sally Mann's work, actually. So much so that that work is just utterly a poem to her family and ideas around intimacy and what it means to, photograph your own family, and for that to then be used and weaponized in relationship to child pornography. And where are the lines? I mean, the lines are a very confusing thing because how things are used after they're made, or even say we're still looking at pervert on the screen. We can change it, by the way.
Will do.
So, one of the things is then just the kind of attachment that people make to those type of images. I've been asked why I would, self-mutilate. A lot of people think of this work as self-mutilation, and it has nothing to do with self-mutilation. It's conceptually planned out. It's a self-portrait, is using my body as a site to create language. So one of the things about work that you can never do is you never can control it 100%. Even though our intent within making it and creating language around it, we definitely have the control in it. Once it goes out into the world, it gets interpreted in all these different ways. So the line is a fuzzy line always. And I think that what you do is you play with the line. You move the line forward, you move the line back. And if you can articulate those kinds of gestures metaphorically within a body of work, then there might be that one person that can actually follow what you're trying to do. And that's, I guess, my answer to that is it's tricky.
Yeah, yeah, it is tricky at best.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you, Jamie and Kathy. While we're sort of on the topic of the medium, I'm going to pass the mic over now to the Rail's own managing editor, Charlie Schultz. Charlie, I think you can take the mic now.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Catherine, and thanks, Lyle. It's been a really, really wonderful conversation. My question is totally technical and sort of a bit banal, but since you mentioned, I've always known you as a large format photographer.
Oh, yeah.
And you mentioned shooting with the 35 on the recent landscape work, and you showed those amazing Polaroids from that huge Polaroid camera. And so my question is how do you think about which tool to use when you're embarking on a project?
It's the language that I want to try to embed within the body of work in terms of what tool I use. So if I want like absolute detail, like I usually do in the studio portraits, because skin and the way that it is and using slight bit of depth of field at times is important in terms of how I make it. But usually I was always about incredible detail. But I also am realizing now that there's something that's happening with having a camera back in my hand and going back to the idea of what it was to be a street photographer, that I even want to mirror within the landscape in a certain point. Because even the cell phones, you're not going to be able to get, you can play around with depth of field a little bit, but you're not going to be able to move it in the same way that you can if you're controlling manually your 35 millimeter. So I think for me, it's always embedded within the relationship to what body of work I'm making in a larger conversation of both the history of photography and within painting, that I decide the tool. But I have a lot of tools. And I really talk all the time. My students, I drive them crazy because all I do is say like, well, don't you want a bigger toolbox? If I teach you how to use these ProPhoto strobes, that's going to give you a bigger toolbox. And if you have a bigger toolbox, you can make the decisions then about how your work is read.
That makes total sense. Thank you, Catherine.
Sure.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Kathy.
That reminds me that there's a scene in Breaking Bad right at the end of the series where Walter White breaks into the house of the person who basically set him on this terrible path, who betrayed him, his old friend. And his old friend is terrified and pulls out a kitchen knife, a little tiny kitchen knife out of the drawer, and waves it at Walter White. And Walter looks at him and says, you know, if we're going to go that way, you're going to need a bigger knife. And I can't tell you how many times I've said that to my students. If we're going to go that way, you're going to need a bigger knife.
That's good.
From big knives to optimism, I'm going to pass the mic over now to Will. Will, you should be able to activate your microphone now.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for the lovely conversation, dialogue that's been happening. Catherine, I just had a question. If you're, you mentioned that you're casually optimistic in these times. Are you turning? Are you turning to any work, or is there anybody's practice right now that's kind of giving you hope in these times, or any inspiration at all?
I am really, really grateful for journalists right now and photojournalists. That I really feel that even though it might be hyperbole at some moments in the way that images are constructed or depicted, that I find the idea of the fact that people are going out and making images at this moment in time to allow me to have a sense of optimism and also hope as a photographer who likes to look at the world a certain kind of permission. And then other work that I like is, you know, we're not able to really go to museums or really see shows. I've tried to look at a lot of Zoom talks like this, or get on in terms of community and so forth. But I know there's all this work out there that I'm missing. I really miss my students. I really miss talking to them.
Me
I
too.
was really hard to go on Zoom teaching. I'm actually on sabbatical this year. But my students for me are always a gauge of, because I'm almost 60 and most of them are still in their 20s or mid 30s. And it's always a gauge to me about what people are thinking about and our relationship to images. And even though I'm working with them as their professor on being an artist and talking about their work, I also feel that I get so much back in terms of understanding what it's like not to be just within my own bubble as an artist.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Will. Okay, so next to the next question. Joseph, you had a question in the chat. I'm going to pass the mic off to you. You should be able to activate your mic.
Yeah, thanks. Hi.
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 Hey.
I had another question about optimism in relation to the sort of split between portraiture and landscape in your works. And I'm thinking about some of my favorite works, which are the freeway overpasses, mini malls.
Yeah.
Both in their subject matter and in the way you've made them seem kind of profoundly optimistic, and particular about America. Whereas I think some of the portraiture, starting with things like Pervert, going to the Ron Athey pictures and some of those, what we refer to as Caravaggesque images, seem, you know, in a literal and metaphorical way, quite dark. Just wondering if you think about that split between the portraits and the landscapes in terms of a kind of optimistic or non-optimistic outlook.
You know, I actually don't, Joseph. I think of the portraits as utterly optimistic, but quieter in a different way. I think that kind of if there's this notion of darkness within it, it maybe is surrounded in relationship to the politics of representation, and what does it mean to, you know, kind of think about the other, but also for me always photograph the idea of the other in the most kind of loving, humanistic way. And so I think that across all the work, no matter what, is the line of empathy and being somebody who really, really utterly believes in humanity. And so that's where I think the optimism lies within all the work, is what is our relationship to humanity. And if you can look at a mini mall as a site to understand the notion of the American dream, of the mom and pop shop and the different immigrant communities that reside within LA, or the freeway as a structure of transportation, but also ripping apart neighborhoods, you know, in terms of gentrification. Those are dark in my mind a little bit in terms of what the 10 freeway did to South Central in Los Angeles. And so the structure, again, what I was talking to Lyle about in the beginning of lecture, is I'm utterly interested in the nuances of structure, both through landscape and a person in terms of their own body, that exists within trying to create representations of humanity, really, and having empathy as a human being.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me, and I want to jump in. It's nice to see you, Joe. I haven't seen you in a while. One of the things that really struck me, and I'm all in on those. just sort of, I was just in LA right before all the COVID stuff really, really went crazy. And some of my happiest experiences were in some of the mini malls in LA, as a matter of fact, because that's where some of the best restaurants
I know, that's always surprising when you take a New Yorker to a mini mall and they're like, this is where we're going to eat. And I'm like, oh, you're going to have the best meal.
But the mini malls and it's a real throwback, but there's an aspect of this that, and I think this is one of the things I like about a lot of the work that you do on the built environment, which is I'm going to show you something that it's not going to be so easy for you to say whether it's a comedy or whether it's a tragedy. I'm not going to be able to, you're not going to be able to say so easily that this is a disaster, because I'm going to show you something and I'm going to make you like it. And to me, that's the most transgressive thing you can do. I'm going to show you something where everybody says it's a bad idea. I'm going to show you why it isn't. And the freeway pictures I was right there with those, because that's, you might say modernism writ large. It's like every fantasy about the future you can think of. The fact that they all turned to shit, that's another issue, okay? But nevertheless, you kind of bring it back for us and you make it a little easy, a little harder to say, this was a mistake. And I love that about your work. I think,
thanks.
I think that's
I've
where
had
we
so
live.
many, I have had so many Angelinos tell me that I changed their commute, because now they just look at the structure and think of the emptiness of the freeways and the platinum printing quality and everything. And they're like, thank you so much for changing my horrible gridlock commute to just like looking up overhead. So
Exactly. Is it a comedy? Is it a tragedy? Well, we can't say for sure.
It's always both, right?
Maybe it's both. It's a tragicomedy.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's always both.
Thank you so much, Joseph. Just a couple more. I think we have time.
I'm
I
good.
want to, awesome. I want to read a question on behalf of Pirana in the audience. And I myself am curious too, if we want to take our attention to it. She asked about, so the Lawrence Wiener portrait that was up earlier on, we didn't really get to it. So I was curious if maybe I could pull that up if we wanted to discuss the context of this photo.
Lawrence.
So yeah, I'll just pass it right over to you, Kathy and Lyle, on this. If there's just any context or description.
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, this is to me, this is the Holbein. This is you kind of channeling Holbein. That incredible specificity and detail. Even what Lawrence Wiener actually looks like. He's got that kind of medieval cast, right?
Well, Lawrence is just like, he's the provocateur, right? And so, I never think about a portrait capturing the essence of a person. I'm actually not that interested in that idea around portraiture, but I am really interested in portraits being a shared moment between two people that is actually very private in a certain way, that even though these portraits become public, because I have an incredible fortunate life that I get to actually show my work to the public. This is Lawrence older, and Lawrence won't be with us forever, and I love the idea of his body, and I asked him to take off his shirt and he really did, and how that beard just creates the shadow on his chest. And Lawrence, if you know him or spend time with him, he's got these long fingernails, and he's he doesn't smoke now because he has health issues, but just this was Lawrence always pontificating. So it's like Lawrence mid pontificating, holding a cigarette, and in a certain way that it does hold how I think of Lawrence and our relationship of just years and years of amazing conversations. And I remember I invited him once to UCLA to give a lecture, and we moved the lectures over to the Hammer. And, I kind of expected him to show some work, right? It's like, well, an artist's lecture, they're going to show some work. No, he just talked to everybody. He just sat on stage and talked. And you could tell with his mouth that it's like he's going to say something to me any moment. And I just really love that about this image. And when I photographed Lawrence or David Hockney or Mary Kelly, or there was a moment where I shifted work to being more of my elders in a certain way. And I think there was an homage to that these, you know, in the same way that unfortunately so many of my friends didn't make it through and they died young, and I had their images as young people because they died of AIDS. Like there was something about this generation of older artists that I had always looked up to, that I wanted to be able to also make portraits of these people that I really care about. And I felt that I learned so much from. And same with the portrait of John Baldessari. John was never my teacher at CalArts, but he was always my teacher in life. And I was able to be on faculty with him at UCLA. And what he gave to the larger community of LA and who he was as a human being was just so utterly important that, you know, I wanted, it's about honoring people in the same way that I honored my community in the early 90s. For me, like making portraits is really about honoring people and having a shared moment with them.
Thank you so much for that.
Sure.
Segueing into that idea of honoring, I'm going to pass the mic now over to Elizabeth. Elizabeth, you should be able to activate your mic.
Yes, hi. Thank you, Nick, and Brooklyn Rail, and Nikki Catherine so much. I just wanted to share. Okay. So I was an undergrad and I was in an art history class, and your Dyke photograph was conversation one day.
Oh, okay.
What
school? What art history class?
Cornell College.
Okay.
Yeah. And that
I always like the contextualizing.
Middle of nowhere in Iowa. But that photograph made it okay for me to come out of the closet.
Oh.
So thank you.
Oh.
And I'm a sculptor. So I photography for me is playing.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a series I'm doing right now with my hair, and close-ups, and treating my hair that I've cut off for years now as barbed wire. And now remembering and looking more at your work the last couple of weeks with, okay, everything's on a screen. Who has inspired me that is so ingrained in my head I don't think about too much, which, you know, you're on that list. But the close-up croppings that I'm doing with these photographs, I'm like, oh, that's why I'm doing this. It's because of you.
Being and having.
Yeah. And, my girlfriend's an amateur photographer. She's good. She needs to think she's better than she is. But she's also from Louisiana.
I'm an amateur too, just so you know. It's always going to be a challenge how to make images, no matter how many years you spend in your life doing it. It's you always kind of feel a little bit like, even though there's a fluidity with your equipment, that you're still like, there's still the amateur somehow.
But yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely nice to meet you.
Too.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Kathy. I want to thank everyone today for joining us and for all of your questions. For our final thoughts, final questions, I'm gonna pass the mic over to our own Phong Bui. Phong, I think you should be able to activate your mic.
Thank you, Nikki.
Yeah.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Lyle. I just reminded now, one of the great Jean Genet essay. You remember, Catherine and Lyle? What if a Rembrandt self-portrait?
Absolutely.
Pieces and flush down the toilet. So it's about vulnerability and dignity, monumentality, and a moment of real, true presence of that being. And I think that's exactly how the wear and tear in Rembrandt late works have manifest that revelation, that real life experience. So truly, finally, he painted himself just like a decaying old man, you know, with the gravity of you know, mortality and about to leave, you know, live lively. My question, since you mentioned John Baldessari, you know, with any affinity, Catherine, in the picture generation, particularly our friend Cindy Sherman.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Cindy is amazing in relationship to spending a life making images that construct these different psyches of American culture within her own body in terms of staging. You know, I've always appreciated that Cindy has really held very true to her practice. I appreciate her kind of experimentation and manipulation at different times, and her humor. I would have a very hard time, you know, not being able to wander through the world. And what's interesting about Cindy is she wanders through the world with herself and kind of representing different moments of psyche, so to speak, through her imagery. And so I have an enormous amount of respect of that. I still like to look at things and not just construct them in the studio, though.
Okay. Thank you, Catherine.
Sure.
Thank you, Phong. So we have a tradition at the Rail every day before we were in quarantine. We all eat lunch together, and we would end lunch by one of our staff members being the designated reader. And we would finish lunch with a poem. So we've taken that tradition into the Zoom virtual sphere, and I'm going to welcome our poet today, Willie. Willie, a quick bio for him. Willie Perdomo is the author of The Crazy Bunch, the essential hits of Shorty Bon Bon, Smoking Lovely, and Where a Nickel Costs a Dime. He is a LucasArts Literary Fellow, a core faculty member at BONA, Voices of Our Nation Writing Workshop, and teaches at Phillips Exeter Academy. Willie, I am passing the mic over to you.
Hello. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Nick. I just want to thank the Brooklyn Rail and the New Social Environment series for the invitation. Subjectively, I think this was a great pairing because I'm a wannabe street photographer, Catherine. I'm a big fan of Roy DeCavara. I'm a big fan of Bruce Davidson's East Harlem photos. I grew up in East Harlem, and I used to say that for my first book, Where a Nickel Costs a Dime, I pretty much wrote all the poems standing on the corner of 123rd Street in Lexington. And kind of walking through Harlem and taking mental snapshots. I was particularly taken by the photo of the three young Black men in the football uniform, and the idea of bearing witness, and how it goes back to the Black gospel tradition, even the kind of narrative tradition of, if the question being that if you don't tell your story, do you cease to exist in many ways? I really appreciated the idea of the pause and the image. I thought was very fascinating for me. And the poem I'm going to read is called Forget What You Saw. It happens right after these young men, and The Crazy Bunch is a chronicle of 5 young men who grow up in East Harlem. They come of age on this particular weekend, and they had just witnessed the death of one of their friends. And this is called Forget What You Saw. 1. And the word whip means car. You want to see. You're in the whip looking. You want to be seen as you see. You want to be seen, and having been seen, never seen again. There's hurt in your eye. It's been there since the Dutch set up shop. You ain't running from nothing, but you ain't chasing nothing either. Looking, as in The best way to watch was the other way. To see before they could say, I saw. You lean to the side and recline, only to see who else is hurting. This is how you decide to gaze these days. 2. Who? This, that, and the third, always looking for something. Light, most definitely black. Bite the sky off it, man. Bring some, they said, you talking so much. The shook ones always live in running starts. What block was that again? Who was that you said again? Who you again? Those tales lie best on nights like these. Who try to at least fly, shoot, please. 3. Yours go bling black, blacker, blacker. Brain split and spilling, spilling, spilling. Your oral history is a constant bomb for the first walk-in and last testament. Hunger, all teeth, no showtime to eat. Apart from money, what do we spend? The starting line ends here in the land of ballers and shot callers, the land of Cuban links and chocofang. Sink as far bottom as you can. You decide. But why always? Why always? Always? Why always? Everything got to be about love. Just wondering, God, it's true. You could be a lot of things given everything that's out there. 4. Forget what you saw. People who know this for sure are very suspicious of this nothing. Blood is always looking for a subject. A little something about the beginning before it starts. The attempts to find yourself at off-peak hours. No images would be perfect for this chill in the cut. Swear to God and kaboom. Bodies fall faster than stock prices. Seen more than the time it takes to forget. The thing is, though, not to stay behind and take the life that was taken from you. Thank you.
Amazing.
Thank you.
When did you write that?
This was from a book called The Crazy Bunch that was published in 2019. I actually wrote it at LIU. I was an MFA student, and that's where some of this poem started. I kind of worked with poets like Louis Warsh. I remember John High, and that's where that poem kind of started. So it was about playing with the white spaces, which is why I was fascinated about the whole idea of the pause in the image. So, yeah.
Oh, thank you so much. That was
Thank
beautiful.
you. Thank you. That was an amazing discussion. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Willie. Thank you.
Thank you,
Kathy.
Willie.
Yeah, right
It's
on. Thank you.
Such a beautiful confluence of these things coming together, and they all connect. I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and especially Kathy and Lyle. This was a very generous and wonderful conversation. Thank you. I want to let the audience know, of course, we do this every day at 1 p.m. Join us on Monday for a conversation with artists Joe Zucker and Joe Bradley with the Rails' own Fong H. Bowie. I would like to invite you all to unmute, or I'm sorry, activate your mics and say goodbye or hello or whatever you'd like to say. And I hope you all have a beautiful weekend. And I think mics are on. So thank you.
Thank you. Adios.
Thank you, Catherine.
Willie,
Thank you.
Hey,
Lyle,
Thank you.
thank
A wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for all the questions, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Stay safe in LA. We are.
With our
thoughts are with
dark skies.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Everybody vote. Get people to vote. Thank you.
Actually, if you want to stick around, anyone that's not registered to vote, I'm posting a chat. I'm going to post a link right now. If anyone's not registered, you can register at this link. So give me a moment and I'll post that. Or we can hang out here if you'd like.
not doing anything.
Catherine, would it be okay if I just like sent you an image of the piece that I'm like, oh my gosh, this happened because of your work?
Yeah, I'm happy to. If you want, I can share my email in the chat, and if you'd like to send that, I can help there.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, just a moment here. I'm getting that register to vote link.
Okay.
And Lyle, I see you made it out of the country safely.
I did. Yeah, and I already would. I'm already feeling ambivalent.
It's always good to feel ambivalent because then you have to like struggle with it and get rid of the ambivalence to just move forward. You know,
I'm tired of this. Yes, I'm tired of the ambivalence, if I may say so. You're in one place, you want to be someplace else. You get there, you want to be someplace else.
I know. It's so hard to feel any kind of sense of motivation in this year. This year has just been like, what?
Yeah.
Like
really weird.
Really? Yeah.
Very strange.
So,
we're trying to make it happen.
Oh. Okay, wait, I think we had some mic issues. I think you can unmute yourselves now. No?
Thank you, Catherine.
There you are.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
That was me because I was shut out. I couldn't say thank you, but now
thank you.
It's very, very compelling, and I learned so much listening to talk about photography, your own work, and beyond the humanity of it all.
Yeah. Well, if anybody's in New York and you can, I think that I think it's still up. I think might be the last weekend. I'm not sure because days have all smushed together.
Yeah.
But the new work of Rhetorical Landscapes, Lehman Maupin did do an installation of it. So, for those who are in New York and want to see what's going on in my mind, especially in terms of the political collages and landscapes. Yeah, I think it's still up. Double check.
That just reminded me of something. If can you still access that PowerPoint, Nick?
Yeah.
Yeah. Would you do me a favor? Would you go to the ice houses pictures? I've got to see where that is. I'm not sure exactly where it is.
Just a second.
And everybody thought we were done, right, Lyle?
Exactly.
Round two.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Right there.
Like the late night show.
So I want just scroll through these guys pretty quickly. Then the next one.
I'm just I know. I'm gonna go there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Next one. Yeah.
Oh,
that's my ice house picture. So I was thinking about this. I've told you before, I love the ice house pictures.
Yeah.
They're all about the Midwest and the lakes and all that kind of stuff. But the other thing that struck me about them was that you have a very specific point of view, and it's the same as the surfers pictures. And the place where I'd seen that before was an American photographer named John Beasley Green, century and a half ago. And what Green did was, as you might be able to say from this picture, is he went to Egypt, and he was really young. Okay, he died, I think he was 28 when he died, but he got around. And he went to Egypt, and one of the things he did was he deliberately took pictures of places and monuments from a distance like this. Shrank them way down.
I'm going to write down this name, Green.
Yeah, G-R-E.
First name?
Yeah, J.B., John Beasley Green. And I was curious about that whole perspective thing on the ice houses and stuff and the surfers. You just shrink them way down. You put them in the way far distance.
Yeah.
You tell me what that was all about. I'm just because I love those pictures.
Well, I think, I guess in some ways it wasn't inspired by this, but it certainly got me thinking about space was Gursky early on, right?
Right.
but I wanted to, you know, when I started photographing the ice houses, it was because I had a residency at the Walker.
Right.
And I was, you know, I was doing with my 810 camera out on the ice. And so I was first doing it, there was blue skies. I was first doing them as horizontals because that's the way that you construct a landscape. And, you know, I had been doing 7 by 17 inch banquet photographs of American cities.
Right.
So when you think about that format, it was automatic that I still wanted to do a horizontal landscape. And then I switched it up where I just decided to do a vertical, and I put that horizon line in the middle. And then I went home and I looked at all the contact sheets because I was teaching at Yale at the time and flying back to Minnesota on the weekends. And all of a sudden there was a blizzard, and then it was white on white. And I'm thinking about Ryman, and I'm thinking about abstract painting and other things. And then that horizon line allowed me to do a fractured panorama. And so what is it in terms of other kind of metaphors of what fracturing the landscape means, you know, and kind of creating a horizon line that continues through all of them when they're hanging, all 14 of them, but that it's always broken, but it's connected. And I guess that I think about community a little bit like that as well. It's like how we enter and exit. And so it just ended up being a format that I kind of got obsessed with. And then Helen Molesworth said it the best, is that that's my line of democracy. It's always equal. So that, you know, there's always the line that goes through that's about my searching for equality.
Yeah, no matter how far away you get.
Yeah, no matter how far I get. And I really love that Helen brought that up, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great. Yeah. Yep. It makes me nostalgic for Michigan, actually. So.
Yeah. Oh, I was the only one on a plane every week on a Thursday, and I would photograph Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, then get back on the plane with all my 810 gear. I'm the only person going like, oh, I hope it's a snowstorm this weekend, because once I saw how the white on white worked, and as well as how the surfers work in that June gloom, like it did this thing to me. And then it's also about temporary communities.
Right. Things that come together and then separate.
Yeah, and separate. Yeah. And the horizon line being the same, but then the fracture of it, the fractured panorama, is the same as community coming in and together metaphorically for me.
Yeah, that's great. Oh, wonderful. Fantastic.
I know, they're really pretty, but there's some thought behind them too.
That's it. Exactly. No more dumb photography.
No, I love that we're like catching a second wind here.
I know. It's good.
Are there any other things you like didn't get to, Lyle?
No, they need to wait for other conversations, I think.
Okay, we're good.
Yeah, okay. We're good. This was great. I really appreciate it, Catherine.
Thank you all. Thank you for such great, insightful questions, and Nick and everybody deciding to spend some time with us. I really appreciate it. And let's just all hope that we get to have a better world somehow.
You know what? It's in the can. We got this one in the bag. I'm convinced.
I hope so. But really, it was fantastic seeing all of you, and thanks for signing in. So signing out from the dark, gloomy skies of LA. Wish us the best luck here on the West Coast. And if they can, tell me something, if they can like bring oil, can't we bring water from the floodplains because there's too much water? Like, don't we just need to pipeline the water in? Like, they do this with oil. I'm just saying, we need a little water out here in the West.
What are the priorities under capitalism? We need to
exactly.
Sounds like a new project, Catherine.
I know. Give us some water. It's just like, okay, bye, everybody.
Thank you so much.
With big